January 23, 1943, France. Northern France lies under a steel-gray sky streaked with smoke. Above the clouds, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses thunder toward the English Channel, their engines trembling under the strain of flak bursts and freezing wind. In the trailing position of the 303rd Bomb Group, one bomber struggles to stay aloft. Its right wing is shredded. One engine is gone. Another sputters, coughing dark oil into the slipstream. The oxygen system is wrecked, the radio dead. Inside, frost coats the metal ribs of the fuselage. The men breathe through cracked masks, their voices raw and clipped. Number 3 engines hit again, the co-pilot mutters. The pilot answers calmly, fighting the controls with both hands. In the waist, a gunner wipes blood from his glove and stares at a hole big enough to crawl through. He counts 57 flak punctures before giving up. Yet the fortress holds. The armor plating is torn, the skin peeled open like paper, but the frame endures. Every shutter feels like the last, until the English coast appears through the haze. When the bomber touches down at Thaley, its landing gear buckles but does not break. Ground crews swarm around the wreck. One mechanic runs his hand over the torn fuselage and whispers, "How did this thing stay in the air?" That question would soon change American bomber design forever. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal test of endurance. The United States 8th Air Force, based in England, was still new to the campaign. Its mission was simple on paper and nearly suicidal in practice: daylight precision bombing of German industrial targets. The plan called for flying directly into the heart of occupied Europe, in tight formations, relying on heavy defensive firepower rather than fighter escort. Commanders believed that the B-17 Flying Fortress could take care of itself. It was a belief born from the bomber's impressive design, a rugged 4-engine aircraft built by Boeing, bristling with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns. Its nickname, Flying Fortress, had been coined by a reporter who saw its prototype in 1935 and was struck by the sight of guns in every direction. But the myth of invincibility didn't last long. Once the missions pushed deeper into Germany, Luftwaffe fighter groups quickly learned how to tear through the bomber streams. The Bf-109s and FW-190s struck in coordinated head-on attacks, exploiting blind spots in the B-17's frontal defense. Each run cost dozens of aircraft. Crews began to whisper about Black Thursday missions, where less than half of a formation returned. Still, the fortresses flew on. Their strategy depended on mass and discipline, tight, interlocking formations where each bomber's guns covered the others. The tactic worked, but only barely. Bombers came home shredded, some missing entire sections of their wings, others with gaping holes through the fuselage. Many limped across the channel on 2 engines, leaving trails of smoke that could be seen for miles. At the bases in East Anglia, Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, Thaley, ground crews began to notice a pattern. The bombers that returned were often scarred in the same places. Wings peppered with flak, fuselages torn behind the cockpit, tails riddled with holes. Yet the planes still flew. Others, hit in different spots, vanished without a trace. In briefing rooms, engineers pinned photos of damaged aircraft to corkboards. They studied the holes like doctors studying wounds. What they saw raised a new question, not just how the planes were hit, but why these particular ones survived. The B-17's designers had given it a strong internal frame, a truss structure of longerons and bulkheads that distributed stress across the body. It was heavier than many engineers preferred, but that extra weight now paid off. Pilots began to trust the fortress the way a sailor trusts a steel hull, as something that might bend but not break. Still, losses mounted. By the start of 1943, the 8th Air Force had already lost nearly 20% of its bomber strength in a matter of months. The U.S. High Command knew that without some breakthrough in survivability, the daylight bombing campaign might collapse entirely. That pressure pushed American engineers, statisticians, and analysts to look deeper into the data. Boeing teams in Seattle corresponded with field repair units in Britain. Damage reports arrived daily. Sheets of aluminum were marked, measured, catalogued. It became clear that brute armor alone wasn't the solution. The real answer might lie in understanding where protection truly mattered, and where it didn't. At the same time, a quiet revolution in analytical thinking was taking shape across the Atlantic. One civilian statistician, working for the U.S. military's research division, proposed a counterintuitive theory about those returning bombers. His insight would upend conventional logic and turn the B-17 from a tough plane into a survivable one. His name was Abraham Wald. When reports from England began reaching Washington, the tone was grim but consistent. Crews praised the B-17's strength, yet every mission seemed to cost more lives. Bomber Command's daylight raids were essential to proving that industrial targets could be destroyed with precision rather than mass saturation, a point of pride for the U.S. Army Air Forces. But with each new sortie, formations returned thinner, bloodier, and more battered. Something had to change. In New York, the Statistical Research Group, SRG, a secret team of mathematicians and analysts, was tasked with helping the military make smarter decisions using data. Among them was Abraham Wald, a quiet Austrian-born statistician who had fled Europe before the war. He wasn't a soldier or an engineer, yet his work would become one of the most famous examples of wartime problem-solving. The Air Force had provided Wald's team with diagrams showing where returning bombers were hit. Each red mark represented a bullet or flak impact logged during repairs. When the diagrams were compiled, they seemed to reveal an obvious pattern: heavy concentrations of damage across the wings, tail, and rear fuselage, especially near the midsection and control surfaces. Military officials concluded that those areas needed more armor. It seemed simple enough: reinforce where the planes were being hit most often. But Wald saw something others missed. The data, he realized, came only from the bombers that made it back. The planes that didn't return were absent from the sample, and their missing data told the real story. In one meeting, Wald reportedly pointed to the red clusters and said, "These are the places where a plane can be hit and still survive." The unmarked areas around the cockpit, engines, and fuel system were the true danger zones. If a plane took hits there, it never came home to be counted. His recommendation was the opposite of the Air Force's initial instinct: add armor to the areas that showed little to no damage on returning aircraft. Protect the engines, fuel tanks, and the crew compartment, the parts too vital to fail. It was a moment of clarity in the chaos of war. Wald's insight was pure logic wrapped in empathy. He understood that behind each missing data point was a missing crew. His analysis transformed the U.S. approach to bomber design from reactive to predictive, not just repairing what broke, but preventing what couldn't survive. Engineers at Boeing and maintenance depots across England began integrating these changes. The focus shifted to reinforcing engine mounts, adding self-sealing layers to fuel tanks, and protecting flight controls with lighter but more strategically placed armor plates. Even the placement of spare parts inside the aircraft was reconsidered, balancing weight while maintaining the fortress's center of gravity. By mid-1943, the results were visible. Returning bombers still carried scars, but they were increasingly superficial. Crew survival rates improved. The fortresses seemed to endure punishment that would have destroyed earlier models. For aircrews, confidence became as important as armor. Pilots who once doubted the Flying Fortress nickname began to believe in it again. Reports circulated of bombers returning with entire stabilizers missing, or with a third of a wing shot away. In mess halls and briefing tents, those stories spread like folklore, except this time they were true. The engineers' quiet revolution was paying off. The B-17's redesign wasn't dramatic, no sweeping new shape or weapon system. It was subtle. Smarter armor, improved structural balance, and better protection where it mattered most. And because it was built on cold, careful observation rather than guesswork, it made the Flying Fortress one of the most resilient machines of the war. But numbers and blueprints alone don't win battles. For every engineer behind a desk, there was a crew in the sky trusting that metal and mathematics would hold. Their belief would soon be tested in one of the most dangerous raids of the entire campaign, the deep strikes into the industrial heart of Germany. From the outside, the B-17 looked like a straightforward machine, a massive, boxy bomber built for endurance rather than beauty. But beneath its dull aluminum skin lay one of the most intelligently designed airframes of the war. Every rib, spar, and bolt served a purpose that reflected the lessons learned from those who flew and those who fell. Wald's redesigns and Boeing's engineering refinements turned the Fortress into something far more sophisticated than its bulky appearance suggested. The improvements weren't about brute strength but about resilience through design, a harmony of structure and strategy. The B-17's mainframe was built around 4 key load-bearing sections. The fuselage used a semi-monocoque structure, a skeleton of longerons and bulkheads that distributed stress evenly throughout the aircraft. This meant that even when large sections of skin were blown away, the plane could still maintain its aerodynamic integrity. In combat, this difference often meant the gap between limping home and falling from the sky. Engineers also improved the protection of critical components. Self-sealing fuel tanks became standard, a remarkable innovation made of layered rubber and treated fabric that expanded when struck by hot shrapnel, automatically plugging leaks. Armor plating was concentrated around the cockpit, protecting the pilot and co-pilot, and along the sides of the radio compartment where oxygen lines and electrical systems converged. The ball turret, a death trap to many gunners, was slightly repositioned and reinforced to reduce vulnerability to flak bursts from below. Even the wings, once considered a weak point, received internal modifications to strengthen the connection points of the engines and control cables. Each refinement came not from theory but from the evidence gathered by mechanics who examined every returning bomber. But what made the Flying Fortress feel bulletproof wasn't just metal. It was how it handled damage. Pilots often described the aircraft as having forgiving controls. Even with 1 or 2 engines gone, it could still be flown with surprising stability. The wide wingspan created lift sufficient to offset severe structural losses. The redundant control systems, duplicate cables and hydraulic lines running through separate channels, gave crews the ability to steer even when half their systems were destroyed. German pilots quickly noticed the difference. Before the redesign, Luftwaffe aces like Egon Mayer and George Peter Eder developed deadly frontal assault tactics, exploiting the B-17's weak nose defenses. After the modifications, and with the addition of the cheek-mounted .50 caliber guns, those same attacks became far more dangerous, not for the bombers but for the attackers. Mayer himself was killed in early 1944 while pressing a head-on attack against a formation of improved fortresses. To the Germans, it felt as though the Americans were learning faster than they could adapt. Their once effective maneuvers now cost them aircraft and pilots they couldn't afford to lose. To the Americans, it was a quiet validation of discipline and data. The lessons from each returning bomber had been turned into armor, structure, and confidence. The fortresses no longer just carried bombs. They carried proof that reason and observation could outlast fear and chaos. But the redesign's most profound impact wasn't just technical. It was psychological. Crews began to believe the plane itself wanted to bring them home. That trust would define the next phase of the campaign, the deep raids into Germany's industrial heartland, where survival depended not on luck, but on the strength of this flying machine. For the men inside those bombers, the redesign wasn't an abstract improvement. It was something they felt in their bones every time flak burst around them. To fly a B-17 was to sit inside a trembling cage of noise, vibration, and cold. A world of metal and oxygen masks, frostbitten fingers, and the constant awareness that the next second could be your last. Crew members often said the aircraft seemed alive. When an engine failed, the entire frame groaned but stayed balanced. When flak punched holes through the wings, the Fortress shuddered and held its course. The engineers' work gave them time, precious minutes that turned certain death into survival. Many who flew the early missions in 1942 noticed the change by 1943. The newer fortresses absorbed punishment their predecessors couldn't. Some returned with parts of their tails gone. Others landed with entire sections missing but the crew still alive. The redesign had turned the B-17 into something more than a machine. It was now a symbol of endurance, a vessel that mirrored the character of the men who flew it. Letters from airmen back home began to reflect this shift. What had once been fatalism became confidence. You'd have to tear her apart piece by piece to bring her down. One pilot wrote to his wife in Ohio. That belief, grounded in real engineering, became a kind of armor of its own. The psychological edge mattered. It kept formations tighter and missions focused, even when enemy fighters swarmed. German pilots began to realize that bringing down an American bomber now demanded far more ammunition and far greater risk. The Luftwaffe's classic head-on attacks became costly, as the newly reinforced nose and additional gun placements transformed the approach into a gauntlet of .50 caliber fire. This resilience forced the Germans to adapt. They introduced heavier cannon armament on fighters like the FW-190A8 and later experimented with upward-firing weapons in the Bf-110 Schrage configuration. But even these desperate innovations couldn't offset the B-17's evolution. For every bomber that fell, others pressed on, engines smoking, wings torn, yet somehow reaching home. And with each return came more data, more proof that the fortress's strength wasn't luck. Mechanics and field engineers in England treated every surviving bomber as evidence, logging damage, tracing bullet paths, and updating design sheets. By summer 1943, even skeptical commanders admitted that engineering and mathematics had done what armor alone never could. They had changed the odds of survival. There was also a moral angle, one that quietly shaped the airmen's perception of themselves. The B-17's durability became a metaphor for American resolve, a steel embodiment of persistence. While German propaganda portrayed Allied bombing as futile, the reality over Europe told a different story. The bombers kept coming, mission after mission, each more determined than the last. The redesign gave them not just protection, but purpose. To German civilians and soldiers watching from the ground, the fortresses seemed endless, battered yet unbroken, a relentless sky-borne factory of destruction. To the Americans inside, it felt like proof that human intellect could outlast brute force. By August 1943, the engineers' work faced its greatest test yet. The U.S. command prepared for a massive two-pronged assault deep into the Reich, a mission that would strike at the heart of Germany's aircraft industry and reveal, beyond any doubt, whether the flying fortress truly deserved its name. August 17, 1943. Dawn broke over the English countryside with the sound of engines. Hundreds of them. Airfields across East Anglia roared to life as crews climbed into their flying fortresses for what would become one of the most ambitious raids of the entire war. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The target was twofold. One wave would strike the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, where Germany's frontline fighters were built. The second wave would hammer Schweinfurt, home to the ball-bearing plants that kept the Nazi war machine turning. It was a bold, daylight attack deep inside the Reich, over 900 miles of hostile airspace with no fighter escort for most of the route. Inside the B-17s, crews prepared in silence. They knew what lay ahead. Missions like this were mathematical in their brutality. Flak belts over the coast, fighter interception near the Rhine, and near-certain chaos over the targets. But there was also quiet pride. These were the improved fortresses, armored, rebalanced, and ready to prove themselves. At 8 a.m., the formations assembled over the North Sea, climbing into the thin blue air. From below, they looked like floating cities, layer upon layer of silver bombers stretching to the horizon. Once across the Dutch coast, the sky erupted. Flak burst around the formation in black blossoms, filling the air with shards of steel. FW-190s and Bf-109s dived through the clouds in coordinated attacks, cannon shells punching into the bomber skins. Yet the formations held their shape. In the lead group, Captain Robert Hull's B-17 Mary Ruth took 3 direct hits to the right wing. A pre-redesigned fortress might have broken apart. This one stayed intact. The damaged engine caught fire, then self-extinguished as the crew cut fuel flow to the tank, one of the small modifications that now saved lives. They dropped their bombs on Regensburg's factory complex and turned south toward North Africa, as planned. The Schweinfurt force, flying behind, faced even worse odds. For nearly 2 hours, German fighters pounded them relentlessly. Crews reported seeing entire bombers disappear in midair, while others, smoking and torn, stayed in formation until the last second. Lieutenant Jack Mathis, a bombardier in the 303rd Bomb Group, watched in disbelief as a fortress beside him took a cannon burst through the tail. The stabilizer sheared off, yet the aircraft kept flying. Its pilot later landed safely in England, his crew shaken but alive. That kind of endurance had been rare a year earlier. Now it was becoming almost expected. When the bombers reached Schweinfurt, The air above the city looked like a furnace. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the formation stayed disciplined. They released their bombs in precision patterns, striking the Kugelfischer and SKF factories directly. Even the Germans on the ground, hardened by years of war, later admitted their shock at how tightly the Americans flew under such punishment. By the time the last fortress cleared German airspace, the mission had claimed 60 aircraft, devastating losses by any measure. But nearly 300 returned, many barely recognizable, others missing wings, tails, or glass. Ground crews at their bases counted hundreds of flak holes, shredded metal, and scorched paint. Yet the aircraft had done what they were built to do. The B-17s had proven something vital that day, not invincibility, but endurance. A machine could be shot to pieces and still carry its crew home. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid became one of the most studied operations in the air war over Europe. It was both a tragedy and a revelation, a demonstration of how far the U.S. had come and how far it still had to go. When the surviving bombers limped home, the runways of East Anglia filled with twisted metal. Ground crews worked through the night, counting holes and patching wings. Some aircraft had lost entire sections of their tails. Others landed with just one engine functioning, hydraulics gone, wheels refusing to deploy. One B-17, later nicknamed the Hangman's Noose, returned with over 600 punctures in its fuselage and still managed to stop safely on the runway. The redesign had done its job. The fortresses had absorbed unimaginable damage, and still the majority made it back. Engineers collected the wrecked panels, laying them out on hangar floors like pieces of an anatomy lesson. Each scar told a story of impact and endurance. For Abraham Wald's theory, this was real-world confirmation on a scale no statistic could predict. But the human cost remained staggering. 600 men were missing, killed, or captured. Many of those who survived were haunted by what they saw. Fortresses spinning down in flames, crews bailing out over enemy lines, formations shredded and scattered across the German countryside. Strategically, the mission achieved mixed results. Regensburg's Messerschmitt plant suffered serious damage, but Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production recovered within weeks. The real victory lay elsewhere, in what the raid revealed about American resilience and German perception. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, studying the damaged aircraft that fell into German hands, were struck by their structural toughness. Reports noted that the new fortresses withstood hits that would have destroyed British bombers. German engineers began to analyze their construction, trying to understand how such large aircraft could keep flying after losing so much material. Within weeks, Luftwaffe tactics shifted. Fighters began using heavier 30mm cannon shells, hoping to punch through reinforced armor. They even experimented with rockets and upward-firing weapons to attack from blind angles. Yet despite every adjustment, they could not reverse the pattern. The bombers still came, and more importantly, they kept coming back. For the Americans, the raid marked a turning point. It proved that daylight bombing could reach deep into Germany and return in strength. Though the cost was brutal, it validated the doctrine and justified the continued investment in technology and adaptation. Behind the scenes, Boeing engineers, now armed with combat data, accelerated further improvements. Stronger wing spars, better armor distribution, and enhanced control redundancies. By late 1943, those refinements merged with another breakthrough, the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang escort fighter. Together, they changed the war in the air. The bombers could now reach Berlin and back with fighter cover, striking at the heart of the Reich's industrial network with a precision and persistence the Germans had never faced before. But even with the Mustangs overhead, it was the fortress that embodied the American spirit. The redesigns had done more than save aircraft. They had preserved faith that technology, discipline, and intellect could overcome even the deadliest skies in history. In the months after Schweinfurt, the crews prepared for new raids with a grim sense of purpose. They knew the odds, but they also knew something else. Their aircraft could take punishment beyond imagination and still bring them home. And that belief, forged in smoke and steel, would carry them into the decisive phase of the air war over Europe. When dawn broke over the English airfields the morning after Schweinfurt, Regensburg, The sight was both triumphant and heartbreaking. Bombers lined the runways like wounded giants. Crews stumbled from their planes, faces gray with exhaustion and soot. Some aircraft returned with half their crews gone. Others landed with flak-damaged controls, one wing hanging by a few spars. Mechanics and medics moved among the wreckage like battlefield surgeons, cataloging damage, counting the cost. Of the 376 B-17s that had set out, only 257 made it back. 60 aircraft were lost outright, and many more would never fly again. The losses shook the 8th Air Force to its core. General Ira Eaker, its commander, faced a grim arithmetic. At that rate, his bomber force would be destroyed in a few months. Yet what struck him even more was how many of the crippled planes had survived. Each returnee carried the physical proof of Abraham Wald's theory. Engineers at Thale, Bassingbourn, and Molesworth spent days measuring and documenting every hit. They compared data against the old armor layouts, mapping how the new reinforcement patterns had performed. Time and again, the results were the same. The strengthened control systems, oxygen lines, and wing routes had kept the aircraft flyable long after the skin was torn apart. One fortress, Hell's Angels, came back with its vertical stabilizer nearly severed. Another, Knockout Dropper, landed after losing half its tailplane and with over 1,000 holes counted by ground crew. Both would have been written off under the old configuration. These planes became living test cases, and the evidence they brought home shaped the rest of the bomber campaign. By November 1943, Boeing and the Army Air Forces issued new production standards based directly on those findings. Armor distribution was standardized across all factories, redundant control cables were required on every model, and the self-sealing fuel tanks were improved with a thicker outer layer of vulcanized rubber. The B-17's defensive firepower was also revised. The single waist guns became staggered to allow freer movement, and the chin turret, first introduced on the B-17G, gave crews a vital forward field of fire against head-on attacks. Together, these changes transformed the aircraft from a sturdy bomber into something almost mythic. Crews spoke of fortresses limping home with wings nearly transparent, of tail gunners shooting until their ammunition ran dry and then watching the earth spin beneath them through holes in the fuselage. These stories spread quickly across bases and briefing rooms. They weren't just tales, they were morale. The press picked up on it, too. Stars and Stripes ran photos of shattered fortresses sitting safely on English runways, calling them the ships that won't die. Boeing used the phrase in morale posters and recruitment drives. In the United States, newspapers printed stories about engineers who built armor where it mattered most, transforming an invisible mathematical insight into a symbol of American ingenuity. But the engineers themselves remained cautious. They knew the redesign didn't make the B-17 invincible. Every bomber that survived represented another that hadn't. Behind each success lay men lost over the North Sea, burned over Schweinfurt, or captured behind enemy lines. Still, what Wald's method had proven, and what the field data confirmed, was that survival could be engineered, and that even in war, reason and analysis could save lives as surely as courage. That balance between intellect and endurance defined the rest of the air campaign, and it set the stage for the next transformation that would finally tilt the skies in the Allies' favor. By early 1944, the lessons of the B-17 redesign were built into every bomber that rolled off the production line. The U.S. industrial network, Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Long Beach, Lockheed Vega in Burbank, worked in near-perfect synchronization. Engineers and inspectors moved between factories with clipboards full of data gathered from Europe. Armor layout diagrams hung beside assembly jigs. Welders and riveters followed new instructions that emphasized not just strength, but survivability. The changes were invisible to most. A few more bolts near the tail assembly, a thicker plate around the control linkage, cables rerouted through protected channels, but to the crews flying at 20,000 feet, they meant everything. Loss rates began to drop. By the spring of 1944, the average bomber survival rate per mission had improved by nearly a third compared to the year before. At the same time, another shift occurred. Long-range escort fighters entered the picture. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its extended range and excellent performance, finally gave the heavy bombers protection deep inside German airspace. The B-17's bulletproof resilience now met its perfect partner air cover that could meet the enemy head-on. Together, they turned what had once been desperate daylight raids into a calculated offensive. By February 1944, during Big Week, the combined bomber offensive struck directly at the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many of them new, factory-fresh fortresses with the updated armor layout, launched wave after wave against factories at Regensburg, Augsburg, Leipzig, and Schweinfurt again. Luftwaffe losses were catastrophic. German fighter strength, already stretched thin, began to collapse under the weight of constant attrition. Captured German reports later confirmed what American engineers had hoped. The improved B-17s were surviving hits that once would have destroyed them. A Luftwaffe officer described the experience in frustration. "We hit them again and again, but they keep flying. They burn, they twist, and still they come." For German aircrews, what had once seemed like an even contest now felt like futility. Back in the United States, Abraham Wald's statistical methods quietly shaped other military programs. The Navy used similar analysis for convoy protection and armor distribution on ships. The Army Air Forces applied the logic to formation spacing and crew training efficiency. Wald himself never saw the B-17 redesign as heroism. He called it common sense made visible. Yet his insight bridged the gap between mathematics and survival, turning theory into something you could touch, fly, and bring home. By the end of the war, over 12,700 B-17s had been built. More than 4,700 were lost in combat. A staggering toll, but thousands of crews owed their lives to the small, deliberate changes born from one engineer's redesign. The concept of damage-informed protection, first applied to the Flying Fortress, became standard practice in post-war aircraft design, influencing everything from the B-29 Superfortress to Cold War jets. When the 8th Air Force returned home, veterans often said the B-17 wasn't just a machine, it was a companion. They spoke of its sound, the rhythm of its engines, the way it would somehow hold together when logic said it shouldn't. The aircraft had earned its reputation not through myth, but through the precision and ingenuity of the people who built it. As the war drew to a close, those same engineers began to see what their work had truly meant. Not just for victory, but for the survival of men who might otherwise have never come home. In the years that followed, the B-17 became more than an aircraft. It became a symbol of endurance. To those who flew it, it was never about glory or myth. It was about trust. Trust that the plane would hold together when everything else came apart. Trust that the men who built it, the riveters, welders, and engineers, had done their job so well that reason itself had become a kind of armor. Abraham Wald never visited a bomber base. He never climbed into a cockpit or felt flak shake a fuselage. But his insight, born from logic and compassion, saved lives in the most human way possible. He had looked not at what was visible, but at what was missing, and in doing so, he saw the truth that others overlooked. His redesign didn't make the B-17 invincible. It made it fair. It gave its crews a fighting chance to bring each other home. For the men who returned from those skies, that was enough. They carried memories of burned aluminum, frozen oxygen masks, and engines that refused to quit. And they carried gratitude, not for luck, but for the quiet brilliance that had turned calculation into survival. Today, the few remaining B-17s still flying carry that same weight of history. Their engines echo across airfields as reminders of a time when the balance between destruction and endurance was measured not just in bombs dropped, but in decisions made behind drafting tables and chalkboards. The Flying Fortress earned its legend not because it couldn't be destroyed, but because it refused to die, and behind that endurance stood one engineer who changed the way war and survival itself were understood.